So now we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. So we combine the two. When we combine the two, we find this kind of a scenario, right? We have an intersection point of the two, and where they intersect is where we have equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price coming in. Now let's assume for a second that you actually have a price which is higher than the equilibrium price. If you have a price point here, at this point the quantity demanded would be lower than the equilibrium quantity. So if this was the equilibrium quantity, the quantity demanded would fall to Q1 and the quantity supplied would increase to Q2 because at a higher price the suppliers are willing to produce more, right? So effectively you have excess supply and you have lesser demand, and let's see how both of these interplay eventually. So what ends up happening is, because of this excess supply, you find that the buyers are willing to pay lesser price. There's just too much of the quantity available in the market, and hence the prices start going down. As the prices start going down, effectively you reach the equilibrium price point. On the other hand, if you have a lower price than you know what is available, then at this point of time your demand curve, which is this curve, shows a bigger quantity demanded than the quantity that the suppliers are willing to supply. This would result in prices actually moving up because the demand is higher and hence people would be willing to pay more, and that's where you have excess demand, which would result in prices going up towards the equilibrium point again. Now such a scenario is a stable equilibrium because if you move prices away from the equilibrium point, they would again tend to move towards the equilibrium point, right? Because of either excess supply or excess demand. Now that's what is called a stable equilibrium. Now let's understand, let's change our test case a little bit. Let's assume we have the same demand curve, but we have a supply curve where you have a downward sloping supply curve instead of an upward sloping supply curve. An example, this is difficult to find in reality, but theoretically an example could be, you know, when workers decide to value a unit of leisure more than a unit of work at higher wages. So at this point, if you increase prices, that doesn't really impact their supply of wages because they don't want to work beyond a point, right? So in this case, if you increase the wage a little bit, they will end up actually working lesser rather than more in this context. So that's a downward sloping supply curve. You have still the demand curve, however, cutting the supply curve from below. In this kind of a scenario, if you have a equilibrium price point and you move away from that for some reason, let's say you move slightly higher, at this point you have excess supply, correct? Because this is your supply curve, this is your demand curve, so this point is quantity supplied and this point is quantity demanded. Because supply is higher than the demand, once again prices will move southwards and it will get moving towards the equilibrium point, right? So prices will move downwards and you will reach the equilibrium point once again. That's again a stable equilibrium because you move back towards the equilibrium point. Now let's change the scenario a little bit and say the supply curve is actually intercepting the demand curve from below. Here we were saying that the supply curve intercepted the demand curve from above. Short-term bumps in price will get corrected. Let's change that a little bit. Let's assume this is my demand curve and now the supply curve intercepts the demand curve from below, which causes an interesting scenario. Okay, so that's my supply curve. When supply curve intercepts the demand curve from below, let's see what happens to pricing. If that's my demand curve, that's my equilibrium price point. Let's assume we move at a higher price. Now at a higher price, the quantity demanded, which is QD, is greater than the quantity supplied, like this, right? And this is quantity demanded, this is quantity supplied. Now because of this, the price would actually increase further because the demand is higher than the supply at this point of time. And because the price increases further, the price actually moves away from the equilibrium. Now this is an unstable equilibrium because a short-term bump in price will result in further higher prices, as now demand is more than the supply and sellers will restrict the supply to create artificial demand. An example of this could be seen in certain asset classes globally, something like real estate, where when prices go up, they keep going higher and higher, and then there is artificial supply crunch created because of that, right? So that's an unstable equilibrium.